Imagine crawling into a hole in the ground barely wide enough for your shoulders. The entrance is hidden in the jungle floor, disguised so well that you almost missed it. You lower yourself into absolute darkness. The walls press against you from all sides. You cannot stand. You cannot turn around easily. You can barely move forward, inching along on your belly like a worm. The air is thick and hot, hard to breathe. Somewhere ahead in this darkness, the enemy waits. They know these tunnels. They built them, they live in them. This is their home and you are the intruder. You have a flashlight in one hand and a pistol in the other. That is all. No backup. No radio that works down here. No room for a rifle or grenades or any of the tools that make you feel like a soldier. Just you, a light, a gun, and whatever courage or madness brought you into this hole in the ground. This is the world of the tunnel rat, and it is as close to hell as any human being has ever voluntarily descended. Welcome to the underground war in Vietnam, where young American soldiers fought a campaign that has no equal in military history. A war in darkness against an enemy you cannot see until they are close enough to kill you with their hands. The tunnels of Vietnam, particularly the massive complex at Cu Cai near Saigon, represent one of the most remarkable engineering achievements in military history. The Vietnamese did not build these tunnels for the American war. They started digging during the war against the French in the 1940s and 1950s. By the time American combat troops arrived in 1965, the tunnel networks in some areas covered hundreds of miles. The main complex at Cu Cai alone stretched for over 150 miles, a vast underground city complete with hospitals, kitchens, sleeping chambers, weapons factories, and command centers. The tunnels existed on multiple levels, some as deep as 30 feet underground. They connected villages, allowed the Viet Cong to appear and disappear like ghosts, and made the area around Saigon effectively ungovernable despite massive American military presence. The Vietnamese who dug these tunnels worked with simple tools, shovels and baskets, sometimes their bare hands. They moved tons of earth, distributing it carefully so that aerial reconnaissance would not spot fresh digging. They built the tunnels small, barely large enough for a Vietnamese person to squeeze through, knowing that American soldiers were generally larger. This was deliberate. The narrow passages were part of the defense. The Vietnamese could move through quickly. Americans would struggle. Every foot of tunnel was designed with defense in mind. Sharp turns to prevent firing down long passages, trapdoors that blended invisibly with the floor, dead ends that looked like passages, false walls concealing deeper chambers, and everywhere booby traps. The Vietnamese were masters of booby traps, and the tunnels were thick with them. When American forces first encountered these tunnel complexes in force, they tried conventional solutions. They would find a tunnel entrance and throw grenades down it, hoping to collapse it or kill anyone inside. This rarely worked. The tunnels were too extensive. A grenade might collapse 10 feet of tunnel, but there were miles more. They tried pumping water into the tunnels. The Vietnamese built drainage systems. They tried pumping in smoke. The Vietnamese built air shafts with hidden exits. They tried pumping in tear gas. The Vietnamese built sealed chambers with doors, and they had gas masks. Every conventional solution failed because the Vietnamese had spent years thinking about these problems and designing counters. Then someone had an idea that seems insane in retrospect. If we cannot destroy the tunnels and we cannot force the enemy out, then we must go in after them. Thus was born one of the most dangerous jobs in the most dangerous war America ever fought. The tunnel rats were volunteers. They had to be, because no sane military organization would order men to do this. The requirements were simple but restrictive. You had to be small. Men over about 5'7" or heavier than 140 pounds generally could not fit through the narrowest passages. You had to be brave beyond normal courage. You had to be a little crazy, because sane men do not crawl into death traps. And you had to volunteer again and again, because one mission was never enough. The tunnels needed constant clearing. The men who became tunnel rats came from all backgrounds. Some were combat engineers tasked with destroying enemy fortifications. Some were infantry who happened to be the right size. A few were misfits who had found something they were good at. Many were Hispanic or Asian American soldiers who tended to be smaller on average than white soldiers. Height and weight standards that might have kept them out of elite units in other wars made them ideal for this nightmare job. They formed an informal brotherhood, tunnel rats recognizing each other, sharing tips and tricks, attending each other's funerals. There were never many of them, maybe a few hundred at any given time across all of Vietnam, but their impact was disproportionate to their numbers. The equipment of a tunnel rat was deliberately minimal. The army issued various tools, but experienced rats quickly learned what worked. A flashlight, usually a small military angle flashlight, or sometimes just a civilian flashlight bought from a PX. Many rats preferred a lighter or matches to a flashlight for part of their work, because a flame consumes oxygen. If the flame starts to gutter and die, you know the air is bad and you need to get out. A pistol, usually a 1911.45 automatic. The .45 was preferred over the 9 because it had better stopping power. In a tunnel, you might get one shot. It needed to count. Some rats carried .38 revolvers because they were more reliable, less likely to jam. A few carried suppressors, improvised or acquired, to reduce the deafening blast of a pistol shot in an enclosed space. Firing a .45 in a tunnel without hearing protection would leave your ears ringing for days. But most rats did not have suppressors and just accepted the temporary deafness as part of the job. Some rats carried knives, although a knife in a tunnel is almost useless. If you are close enough to use a knife, the enemy can use one on you, and they know the tunnels better. A few carried grenades, although using a grenade in a tunnel is suicidal unless you are very close to an exit. The blast has nowhere to go. It will collapse the tunnel on you or rupture your organs from overpressure. The concussion alone in a confined space can kill. So grenades were rarely used except to destroy a cleared tunnel complex. Some rats carried rope, a sensible precaution so that others could pull you out if you were wounded or trapped. A few carried primitive communications gear, although most radios did not work underground. The dirt absorbed the signal. What they did not carry is almost as important as what they did. No rifle. An M16 is 39 inches long, far too long to maneuver in a narrow tunnel. You cannot aim it, cannot turn corners with it, cannot bring it to bear if an enemy is in your face. No body armor. The tunnels were too tight. The armor added bulk and restricted movement. No helmet most of the time. Helmets scraped against the tunnel roof, made noise, and interfered with hearing. Hearing was critical. Often you heard the enemy before you saw them. The scrape of a boot, the sound of breathing, the click of a weapon being readied. These sounds gave you a second or two of warning, enough to shoot first if you were fast and lucky. The tunnel rat's uniform was usually just fatigues, often cut down or modified for easier movement. Some rats stripped down to pants and t-shirts. Some worked shirtless despite the danger of abrasions. Boots, always boots, because you never knew what you might step on. The Vietnamese left punji stakes, sharpened bamboo stakes often dipped in feces so that wounds would become infected, everywhere in the tunnels. They left boards with nails driven through them. They left pressure plates that triggered traps. Boots provided some protection, though not much. Gloves were optional. Some rats wore them to protect their hands while crawling. Others went barehanded because they wanted to feel what they were touching in the dark. The process of clearing a tunnel began with finding it. This was harder than it sounds. The Vietnamese were masters of camouflage. Tunnel entrances were hidden under leaves, in termite mounds, inside buildings, underwater in rice paddies, anywhere that would avoid detection. American soldiers learned to look for telltale signs. An area of ground that looked recently disturbed. A suspicious mound. Steam rising from the ground in the morning, indicating warm air from the tunnels below. Ants or other insects going in and out of a specific spot. Sometimes they used dogs, German shepherds trained to detect the smell of humans underground. The dogs were good, but not perfect. The Vietnamese used pepper and other substances to mask their scent. Once an entrance was found, the tunnel rats' work began. Standard procedure was to call down into the tunnel first, in Vietnamese if possible, demanding surrender. This almost never worked. The Vietnamese in the tunnels were not going to surrender. They were there to fight, but the protocols of war required the offer. Then, if there was no response, or if the response was gunfire, the rat would prepare to enter. This preparation was mostly mental. There is no physical preparation for crawling into a death trap. You just had to make your peace with the possibility of dying in the dark and go. The descent into the tunnel was the worst part for many rats. Entering that darkness, feeling the walls close in, knowing that from this moment until you emerged, you were in mortal danger with every breath. The entrance hole was usually vertical, a tight shaft that dropped anywhere from 3 to 10 feet. You lowered yourself feet first, or sometimes head first, depending on the configuration, using your hands and feet to control your descent. At the bottom, you found yourself in a tunnel perhaps 3 feet high and 2 feet wide, sometimes smaller. You got on your hands and knees or on your belly and you started moving. The darkness in a tunnel is absolute. If your flashlight fails, you are blind. Some rats developed a technique of moving partly in darkness, using the light only briefly to get oriented and then switching it off to preserve batteries and to avoid giving the enemy a target. Others kept their light on continuously, unwilling to move blind. The darkness played tricks on your mind. You saw things that were not there. You heard things that might be real or might be your imagination. The psychological pressure was immense. Every noise was a potential threat. Every shadow might be an enemy. The tunnel could collapse at any moment. You could trigger a trap at any moment. You could turn a corner and come face to face with a Viet Cong fighter at any moment. The traps were ingenious and terrifying. The Vietnamese had years to develop and refine them. Punji pits, covered holes with sharpened stakes at the bottom, positioned to catch a crawling man's hand or to impale him if a section of tunnel floor gave way. Crossbows, rigged to fire when a tripwire was touched, the bolt traveling down a narrow tunnel where there was no room to dodge. Grenades, both American grenades captured and booby-trapped, and crude homemade grenades. These would be rigged to detonate when a door was opened or a wire was tripped. The explosion in a confined tunnel was devastating. Snakes, poisonous snakes put in small boxes or baskets, positioned to fall on or strike at anyone passing. Scorpions similarly deployed. The Vietnamese even used bees or wasps, nests positioned to break when disturbed, releasing angry insects in a space where you could not escape. The most feared trap was the mace, a weight studded with nails suspended from the ceiling, held by a tripwire. When triggered, it would swing down and strike the victim with tremendous force. In a low tunnel where you were crawling, this could crush your skull or drive nails deep into your back. There were also trapdoors that opened into pits, false walls that collapsed, and countless variations on these themes. The Vietnamese were endlessly creative. Each tunnel system had its own unique traps. You could never assume that, because you had cleared one tunnel safely, you knew what to expect in the next. Combat in the tunnels was brief and brutal. The distances were measured in feet, not yards. If you encountered an enemy fighter, you might have a second to react. Speed was everything. The rat who shot first usually survived. The rat who hesitated died. The pistol was the weapon of choice because it was small and could be aimed quickly. But even a pistol was awkward in the extreme close quarters. Some tunnel rats learned to shoot instinctively, point shooting without aiming, letting muscle memory guide the bullet. Others developed quick-draw techniques. A few became legendary for their speed and accuracy. The .45 automatic was powerful enough to kill with a single shot. Even a shot to an extremity could incapacitate due to shock and blood loss in the confined space. But the .45 also had drawbacks. The muzzle flash in darkness was blinding. The blast was deafening. The recoil was substantial. After firing, you were deaf and half-blind for critical seconds. If there was more than one enemy, you were vulnerable. Some rats carried a backup weapon, a second pistol or a knife, for exactly this reason. Others relied on the 7 rounds in a .45 magazine plus 1 in the chamber, 8 shots, against an unknown number of enemies, in the dark, underground, no backup, no escape route except back the way you came. The psychological terror of tunnel fighting is hard to convey to anyone who has not experienced it. Combat above ground is terrifying enough. You can be killed at any moment, but above ground you can see, you have room to move, you can run, take cover, call for help. In a tunnel, none of these options exist. You are trapped in a coffin of earth with armed men trying to kill you. The walls press in on all sides. The air is foul. The heat is stifling. Sweat pours off you. Your heart pounds so hard you think the enemy must hear it. Your breathing sounds loud in your ears. Every muscle is tense. You move inch by inch, expecting death at any moment. The Vietnamese fighters in the tunnels were formidable opponents. They were small, as mentioned, which gave them a mobility advantage. They knew the tunnels intimately, could move through them in near darkness, knew every turn and trapdoor. They were motivated, fighting for their homeland, willing to die to kill an invader. Many were veterans, experienced in tunnel combat. They had fought the French underground. They had trained for years. They were disciplined and patient. They would wait in a sealed chamber, silent and still, as American soldiers passed within feet. Then they would emerge and attack from behind. Or they would wait at a junction, listening, and when they heard a tunnel rat approaching, they would ready their weapon and fire the moment the American came into view. The Vietnamese in the tunnels had their own weapons optimized for this environment. Often they used captured American pistols or carbines. Sometimes they used crude homemade guns. Some carried only knives, relying on stealth and surprise. A few used silenced weapons, though these were rare. The Vietnamese also used the tunnel's architecture as a weapon. They would lure Americans into dead ends and then block the exit. They would collapse sections of tunnel, trapping rats underground to suffocate or starve. They would flood tunnels with water or gas. They fought with intelligence, and ruthlessness. The physical toll on tunnel rats was severe even without injury. Crawling through tight spaces for hours, abraded knees and elbows raw. The heat and humidity caused dehydration. The bad air caused headaches, nausea, and disorientation. Many rats emerged from the tunnels vomiting. Some passed out from heat exhaustion or oxygen deprivation. The stress caused some men to shake uncontrollably. Others became temporarily mute, unable to speak from the psychological trauma. Even rats who had been down many times sometimes emerged broken, unable to go back down. There was no shame in this. Every man has a breaking point. The only question was whether you reached it before you got killed. Injuries in the tunnels were often fatal. A wounded tunnel rat could not be easily evacuated. The tunnels were too narrow for stretchers. A wounded man had to crawl out on his own or be dragged out by his feet, an agonizing process that could take hours. During that time, he was bleeding, going into shock, possibly dying. The evacuation team also put themselves at risk, entering the tunnel to reach the wounded man, vulnerable to the same traps and ambushes. Medical care was difficult to provide in the tunnel. There was no room to work. The medic had to treat the casualty in near darkness, in a confined space, possibly under fire. Many wounded tunnel rats died not from their initial injuries, but from bleeding out during the slow extraction process. The psychological profile of a tunnel rat is fascinating. Military psychologists who studied them found interesting patterns. Many were introverts, comfortable with solitude. Many had claustrophilia rather than claustrophobia. They actually liked small enclosed spaces, found them comforting rather than frightening. Many had exceptional spatial awareness and memory. They could navigate complex tunnel systems mentally, remembering turns and junctions. Many were highly observant, noticing small details that others missed. And many had a kind of controlled recklessness, a willingness to take enormous risks combined with enough caution to survive. The esprit de corps among tunnel rats was strong. They understood each other in ways that other soldiers could not. They shared an experience so extreme, so beyond normal human experience, that it bonded them. Tunnel rats looked out for each other. They shared techniques and intelligence. If a rat discovered a new type of trap in one tunnel system, he would warn other rats. If a rat was killed, others would volunteer to go back into that same tunnel to recover his body. The code was that no one was left behind, ever. This was not just sentiment, it was practical. If bodies were left in the tunnels, the Vietnamese would booby-trap them. Other rats would die trying to recover them later. Better to take the risk immediately. The Vietnamese perspective on the tunnel rats is illuminating. After the war, former Viet Cong fighters spoke with respect about the Americans who came into the tunnels. They acknowledged the courage it took. Some said they thought the tunnel rats were crazy. Some said they understood that the tunnel rats were just soldiers doing their job, like themselves. The Vietnamese who fought in the tunnels also suffered. Many died, killed by the rats they hunted or by cave-ins and accidents. Many were wounded, left to die in sealed sections of tunnel when the Americans collapsed the passages. Many suffered from the same psychological trauma as the American rats, nightmares and fears that persisted long after the war. The tunnels at Cu Cai became almost mythical among American forces. The 25th Infantry Division was headquartered directly above a major section of the Cu Cai tunnel complex for years before they fully realized it. The Viet Cong could literally hear the Americans above them, walking on the surface. At night, VC fighters would emerge from hidden entrances, attack American positions, and then disappear back underground before reinforcements arrived. It was maddening. The Americans controlled the surface during the day. The VC controlled it at night, and the VC always controlled the underground. The 25th Infantry Division and the 1st Infantry Division, both operating in the Ku Kai area, developed specialized tunnel rat teams. These were small units, usually just a handful of men, dedicated to clearing tunnels. They developed standard operating procedures, techniques that improved survival rates. Always work in pairs if possible, one man in the tunnel, one at the entrance to provide security, and to pull the first man out if needed. Always map the tunnels as you go, marking junctions and chambers so you can find your way back. Always leave markers, chemical light sticks or chalk marks to show where you have been. Always move slowly, checking for traps, never rushing. Always listen more than you look. Often you hear threats before you see them. The work of destroying tunnels once they were cleared was almost as dangerous as clearing them. The standard method was to rig demolition charges, C4 plastic explosive, at key points in the tunnel system. The charges would be connected by detonation cord and wired to a detonator. Then everyone would evacuate and the charges would be blown, collapsing the tunnels. But the Vietnamese built their tunnels to survive this. They used reinforced chambers, thick earth between levels, complex architecture that absorbed blast effects. A tunnel system that looked destroyed would often have sections that survived. Weeks later, the VC would be using them again. The Americans experimented with various methods to destroy the tunnels. They tried pumping in acetylene gas and igniting it, creating a fuel-air explosion. This worked sometimes, but was dangerous to the demolition team. They tried pumping in water and then explosive charges to create hydrostatic shock. They tried collapsing the tunnels with bombs dropped from aircraft, but this rarely worked because the tunnels were too deep. They tried using Rome plows, massive bulldozers with special blades, to literally plow the ground to a depth of several feet, exposing and destroying the tunnels. This was effective, but slow and required securing large areas. The most controversial method was CS gas, a persistent tear gas agent. This was pumped into tunnels in large quantities. The gas was heavier than air and would sink into the lower levels. It caused immediate incapacitation, intense burning of the eyes, nose, and throat, vomiting, and temporary blindness. The idea was to force the VC out or kill them if they stayed. The use of CS gas in tunnels was technically legal under the rules of war because CS is a riot control agent, not a war gas like mustard or nerve gas. But the concentrations used were far beyond riot control levels. People exposed to that much CS in an enclosed space could suffer permanent damage or death. Human rights groups criticized the practice. The American military defended it as a necessary measure to avoid sending men into the tunnels. The tunnel rats themselves had mixed feelings about CS gas. On one hand, it made their job safer by potentially clearing tunnels without them having to enter. On the other hand, the gas did not always work. The VC had gas masks, they had sealed chambers, and CS residue in a tunnel made it hell for the rats who had to go in afterward. The gas would still be present, clinging to the walls, crystallized on surfaces. Disturbing it would release it back into the air. Rats who entered gas tunnels often emerged coughing and retching, their eyes streaming tears, their skin burning. Some refused to enter recently gassed tunnels without protective gear, but protective gear was bulky and restricted movement even more than usual. The intelligence gathered from the tunnels was valuable. Documents found in underground command centers revealed VC plans and troop movements. Captured weapons showed what the enemy was using. The tunnels themselves, once mapped, revealed the extent of VC infrastructure. But gathering this intelligence was dangerous. Rats had to search chambers and rooms, rifling through papers and equipment while watching for booby traps. The VC knew the Americans wanted intelligence. They booby-trapped document caches. A rat opening a bag of papers might trigger an explosion. Some traps were psychological, designed not to kill but to terrify. A severed head placed in a box, rigged so that it would roll out when the box was opened. This sounds like Hollywood fiction, but it happened. The psychological warfare was constant, and it worked. Men who survived physical traps sometimes broke from the mental ones. The physical size requirements for tunnel rats created an interesting demographic pattern. Many of the rats were Hispanic Americans or Asian Americans, groups that on average are smaller in stature than white or black Americans. This meant that minorities were disproportionately represented in one of the war's most dangerous jobs. Some saw this as another example of inequality in the military, minorities taking on the worst risks. Others pointed out that these soldiers volunteered, that they were not forced into the role. The truth is probably more complex. Yes, they volunteered, but in the military, volunteering is often encouraged or expected in ways that blur the line with being ordered. A commander asking for volunteers, then looking directly at the three smallest men in the unit, is technically giving them a choice, but the social pressure is immense. Some of the most famous tunnel rats were indeed minorities. Sergeant Arnold Gutierrez, a Hispanic American, became legendary in the 25th Infantry Division for his tunnel-clearing skills and his courage. He survived dozens of missions into the tunnels. He trained other rats. He developed new techniques for detecting traps. After the war, he rarely spoke about his experiences. Specialist Melvin Frazier, an African American, was another notable rat despite the size requirements often limiting black soldiers from the role. Frazier was unusually small for his ethnicity and became one of the most experienced rats in his unit. He credited his survival to caution, faith, and luck, in that order. The life expectancy of a tunnel rat was not officially tracked, but anecdotally it was short. Some rats survived dozens of missions, others died on their first. The randomness was part of what made it so terrifying. You could do everything right and still trigger a trap you could not have detected. You could be the most skilled, most experienced rat in Vietnam and still turn a corner into an enemy ambush. There was skill involved, certainly. Good rats learned techniques that improved their odds. But there was also a huge element of chance. The rats who survived knew this. They did not think of themselves as invincible. They thought of themselves as lucky, and they knew luck runs out. The end of the tunnel rat era came gradually. As the war progressed and American strategy shifted from search and destroy to Vietnamization, the emphasis on clearing tunnels decreased. By the early 1970s, there were fewer tunnel rats in the field. Some had completed their tour and gone home. Some had been killed. Some had broken psychologically and been reassigned. New soldiers were not being trained as rats in the same numbers. The job had always been something of an improvisation, never a formal military occupational specialty with its own training pipeline and career path. It was something units did because they needed it done, not because the army had a doctrine for it. After the American withdrawal from Vietnam in 1973, the tunnels remained. Many are still there today. The Vietnamese preserved sections of the Cu Kai tunnels and opened them to tourists. You can visit them now, crawl through widened and reinforced sections, see the underground hospitals and kitchens, watch demonstrations of how the VC lived underground. The tourist tunnels give a sanitized, safe version of what the real tunnels were like. They have been widened to accommodate Western tourists who are larger than Vietnamese fighters. They have been cleared of traps and dangers. They have lighting and ventilation, but even in their safe, tourist-friendly form, they are unsettling. The low ceilings, the narrow passages, the darkness, all combine to give a small taste of what the tunnel rats experienced. Many tourists emerge after just a few minutes underground, relieved to be back in the sunlight and air. The psychological aftermath for tunnel rats was severe. Many suffered from what we now call PTSD, but what was then called shell shock or combat fatigue, or was not recognized at all. The symptoms were classic. Nightmares, often of being trapped underground, unable to breathe, walls closing in. Flashbacks triggered by enclosed spaces. Panic attacks in elevators or small rooms. Hypervigilance, always scanning for threats, unable to relax. Anger and irritability. Difficulty sleeping. Substance abuse as a form of self-medication. Depression. Some tunnel rats adjusted relatively well after the war, others never recovered. The nature of their trauma was specific and intense in ways that even other combat veterans sometimes did not understand. There was also a physical toll that emerged years later. Many tunnel rats suffered from respiratory problems, likely from breathing bad air, dust, and chemical agents in the tunnels. Some developed hearing loss from firing weapons without ear protection in enclosed spaces. Some had joint problems from crawling on hard surfaces. Some had skin conditions from exposure to contaminated soil and dirty water. The VA recognized these as service-connected disabilities, but often decades after the fact, after years of the veterans suffering without understanding why. The recognition of tunnel rats as a distinct group within the Vietnam veteran community came slowly. Unlike paratroopers or rangers or other elite units, tunnel rats had no official designation. They wore no special insignia or badge. There was no tunnel rat school. They were just soldiers who did a particular job. After the war, as veterans began to tell their stories, the tunnel rats emerged as a group. Books were written about them. Documentaries were made. They held reunions. Organizations formed to connect tunnel rats and to preserve their history. The recognition was important psychologically for many of these men. For years, people had not believed their stories or had minimized what they had done. Now, finally, there was acknowledgement. The courage of the tunnel rats deserves to be emphasized. There are many kinds of courage in war. The courage to charge into enemy fire. The courage to hold a position against attack. The courage to fly into flak. But the courage to crawl into a dark hole in the ground, knowing that the enemy is waiting, knowing that you might die at any moment in the most claustrophobic, terrifying way imaginable, and doing it anyway, that is a special kind of courage. It is not the courage of a moment, the adrenaline-fueled rush of a charge. It is the cold, calculated courage of walking deliberately into nightmare. It is the courage of continuing to do something terrifying again and again because the mission requires it. Some tunnel rats developed almost superhuman abilities through practice. They could move through tunnels in near silence, avoiding loose dirt that might crunch underfoot, controlling their breathing, moving with a fluidity that seemed impossible in such cramped spaces. They developed night vision that allowed them to see in near darkness. their eyes adapting to pick up tiny amounts of light. They developed spatial memory that allowed them to navigate without maps, remembering every turn. They developed a sixth sense for danger, an intuition that warned them when something was wrong. Whether this was truly a sixth sense or just the subconscious processing of subtle clues, it saved lives. Experienced rats would suddenly stop and refuse to proceed, unable to articulate why, but certain that danger lay ahead. Often, careful investigation would reveal a trap. The relationship between tunnel rats and combat engineers was close. Engineers had the demolitions expertise to destroy tunnels. Rats had the knowledge of the tunnel layouts and the courage to go in first. They worked together, the rat clearing the tunnel, the engineer coming behind to map it and rig explosives. This partnership required trust. The engineer trusted that the rat had cleared the tunnel properly. The rat trusted that the engineer would not blow the charges until everyone was out. Mistakes happened. Men died when charges were detonated prematurely or when timers malfunctioned. The margin for error was razor thin. The impact of the tunnel system on the overall war is hard to quantify but significant. The tunnels allowed the Viet Cong to maintain a presence in areas that were nominally controlled by American and South Vietnamese forces. They could not hold territory above ground, but they could hold it underground. This meant that no area was ever truly secure. The VC could emerge at night, conduct operations, and vanish. This constant threat tied down large numbers of American troops who might otherwise have been used elsewhere. It also had a psychological impact. American soldiers never felt safe, even in areas far from active combat zones. The enemy could literally be under your feet at any moment. The tunnel systems also provided sanctuary for wounded VC fighters and for civilians fleeing combat. Underground hospitals, crude by Western standards but functional, treated thousands of patients during the war. The hospitals were staffed by doctors and nurses who lived underground for months or years, rarely seeing sunlight. They operated under the worst conditions imaginable, performing surgeries by candlelight or flashlight, with limited supplies, constant danger of discovery. Many medical personnel died when their hospital sections were bombed or gassed, but others survived and continued their work, a testament to their dedication. The tunnels were also home to families. Civilians, particularly in areas of heavy fighting, would shelter in the tunnels during bombardments. Entire villages would go underground when American or South Vietnamese forces swept through. Children were born in the tunnels. People died in the tunnels. Life continued underground in ways that seem almost unimaginable. The psychological impact on a generation of Vietnamese who spent their childhood underground is incalculable. Many of these individuals, now elderly, still suffer from the trauma. The American public knew little about tunnel rats during the war. The media focused on more visible aspects of the conflict, big battles, bombing campaigns, political developments. The underground war was too small-scale, too unglamorous to attract much attention. Journalists embedded with units sometimes encountered tunnel rats, but rarely spent much time with them. The work was too dangerous and claustrophobic to make for good footage or dramatic stories. It was only after the war, as veterans began to tell their stories, that the public learned about this aspect of the conflict. The tactical lessons from the tunnel war were studied by military planners, but their application was limited. Tunnel warfare is specific to certain types of conflicts and terrain. The lessons learned in Vietnam had little immediate application in the Cold War context of preparing for potential conflict in Europe. But some of the lessons about close-quarters combat, about fighting in restrictive terrain, about the psychological challenges of confined space combat, these found their way into training for urban warfare. When American forces began fighting in cities in Iraq and Afghanistan, some of the techniques developed by tunnel rats proved relevant. Clearing buildings is not identical to clearing tunnels, but there are similarities. The close quarters, the danger of ambush, the need for careful movement and constant vigilance all translate. The comparison between tunnel rats and soldiers in other claustrophobic combat environments is interesting. Submariners, for example, live in confined spaces and face the constant danger of death by drowning or suffocation. But submariners are not constantly in combat. They have periods of relative safety. Tunnel rats were in combat from the moment they entered until they exited. Soldiers fighting in bunkers or trenches face close-quarters combat, but usually have more room to maneuver than tunnel rats. Cave fighting, which occurred in the Pacific during World War II, is perhaps the closest analogy. American Marines fighting in caves on islands like Iwo Jima faced similar challenges: tight spaces, hidden enemies, booby traps. But even cave fighting usually offered more space than Vietnamese tunnel combat. The ethics of tunnel warfare raise interesting questions. Was it ethical to send men into such danger? The military would argue yes, it was necessary to neutralize a threat. The tunnels were being used for military purposes and had to be cleared. Others might argue that the danger was so extreme that asking men to do this violated some moral principle. But this argument is hard to sustain. War is inherently dangerous. Some jobs in war are more dangerous than others. As long as men volunteer and are not coerced, it is hard to say that giving them a dangerous job is unethical. The alternative, leaving the tunnels operational, would have cost more lives in the long run. The question of whether the tunnel rat program was effective is more clear-cut. Yes, it was effective in the narrow sense. Tunnels were cleared, intelligence was gathered, VC infrastructure was disrupted, but in the broader strategic sense, the tunnels could not be eliminated. There were too many of them. They were too easy to rebuild. Even after intensive clearing operations, the VC would return and reoccupy. The tunnel systems survived the war and remain today as monuments to Vietnamese determination. So the tunnel rats succeeded in their immediate missions, but could not achieve the larger goal of eliminating the tunnel threat. The personal accounts of tunnel rats are both harrowing and illuminating. Many describe the moment of entering a tunnel as a transition, leaving the world of light and sound and entering a different realm where normal rules do not apply. They describe the feeling of Earth pressing in on all sides, the struggle to control fear, the strange calm that sometimes descended once they were fully committed. Some describe almost out-of-body experiences, watching themselves move through the tunnels as if from outside. Some describe time distortion, hours that felt like minutes or minutes that felt like hours. All describe the overwhelming relief of emerging back into sunlight and air, the feeling of being reborn. The dreams and nightmares of tunnel rats often feature being trapped underground, unable to move, unable to breathe. These dreams sometimes persist for decades. Some rats report that they cannot use elevators or go into basements without feeling panic. Some have to sleep with lights on because darkness triggers memories of the tunnels. Some refuse to go underground for any reason, will not go into subways or underground parking. The phobia is specific and powerful, rooted in genuine trauma rather than irrational fear. The bonds between tunnel rats often lasted a lifetime. Men who served together in Vietnam would reconnect years later and discover that they still had more in common with each other than with almost anyone else. Their families sometimes could not understand them. Other veterans sometimes could not understand them, but another tunnel rat understood implicitly. This created friendships of unusual intensity and loyalty. Tunnel rats looked out for each other long after the war ended, helping each other find jobs, supporting each other through psychological crises, attending each other's funerals. The legacy of the tunnel rats in military culture is modest but real. They are remembered as examples of extraordinary courage. They are used in training to illustrate the importance of adapting to unique challenges. They appear in books and films, though often in minor roles. The 1990 film The Tunnels of Ku Kai brought some attention to their story, though it was not a major commercial success. Various documentaries have featured tunnel rats. Books like The Tunnels of Ku Kai by Tom Mangold and John Pennicott told their story in detail. But compared to other elite units from Vietnam, like the Navy SEALs or the Army Rangers, tunnel rats receive relatively little attention. This is partly because there was no formal tunnel rat unit that survived the war. There is no tunnel rat regiment that continues to exist and maintain traditions. The rats were individuals from various units who did a specific job. When the war ended, they scattered back to their regular units or to civilian life. There was no institutional structure to preserve their legacy. It fell to the veterans themselves to keep their story alive, and many of them were too traumatized to talk about it for years or decades. The Vietnamese perspective on the tunnels is one of pride. The tunnels represent Vietnamese resilience and ingenuity. They show that a poor country with limited resources can resist a superpower. The tunnels are celebrated in Vietnam as symbols of the resistance. The women who helped dig and maintain the tunnels are honored. The fighters who defended them are remembered as heroes. The Ku Kai tunnels in particular have become a major tourist attraction, visited by thousands of people each year. The site is maintained by the Vietnamese government and presented as a patriotic landmark. Interestingly, some American tunnel rat veterans have visited the Ku Kai tunnels as tourists years after the war. These visits are emotionally complex. The veterans see the places where they fought and where their friends died. They see the tunnels that tried to kill them now packaged for tourist consumption. They sometimes meet former VC fighters who defended those same tunnels. These encounters are usually cordial, marked by mutual respect. Both sides recognize the courage of the other. Both sides have moved beyond the immediate hatred of combat to a more reflective understanding. But the visits are not easy. Many tunnel rat veterans report being overwhelmed by emotion when seeing the tunnels again. The physical skills required for tunnel warfare cannot be overstated. Crawling through a 2-foot-high tunnel requires strength, flexibility, and endurance. Your legs propel you forward. Your arms feel ahead for obstacles. Your core muscles support your weight. It is exhausting physical work even before you add the stress of combat. Some tunnel rats were in superb physical condition, able to move quickly through the tunnels for extended periods. Others relied more on technique than strength, moving efficiently to conserve energy. But all had to maintain a baseline level of fitness. An out-of-shape soldier simply could not do the job. The sensory deprivation in the tunnels was another challenge. With only a small flashlight, you could see very little. Sound was muffled by earth. Touch became your primary sense. You felt your way forward, fingers probing the walls and floor, searching for tripwires or pressure plates. Your sense of smell became acute. You could smell explosives, the oily scent of plastic explosive or the sulfur smell of gunpowder. You could smell death, the unmistakable odor of decomposing bodies. You could smell the enemy, the smell of fish sauce and nuoc mam that was a staple of Vietnamese diet, a smell that clung to VC fighters. The question of who the bravest tunnel rats were is impossible to answer, but certain names stand out. Captain Herbert Thornton of the 1st Infantry Division became known for his willingness to enter tunnels even after being wounded in them multiple times. Sergeant Bernard Justin was credited with clearing more tunnel systems than any other rat in his division. Specialist Robert Bayer developed new techniques for detecting booby traps and trained other rats. These men and others like them represent the best of the tunnel rat ethos, courage tempered with skill, aggression balanced with caution. Some tunnel rats died in ways that haunt their fellow veterans decades later. There is the story of a rat who entered a tunnel and simply never emerged. His partner at the entrance called down to him, no response. Other rats went in to search. They found the tunnel blocked by a cave-in. They dug frantically but could not reach him in time. He suffocated in the dark, alone, buried alive. There is the story of a rat who triggered a grenade trap. His body absorbed most of the blast, saving the lives of the men behind him but killing him instantly. There is the story of a rat who encountered an enemy fighter in the tunnel and won the gunfight but was wounded. He crawled back toward the entrance, calling for help, but bled out before he could be reached. These stories, and hundreds like them, are the reality behind the statistics. The tunnel rats of Vietnam deserve a place in the pantheon of American military courage, alongside the most celebrated heroes of any war. They faced a unique horror and did so repeatedly. They saved lives by clearing tunnels before larger operations. They gathered intelligence that shaped American strategy. They killed enemy fighters and destroyed enemy infrastructure. But most importantly, they demonstrated that the human spirit can overcome almost any fear when duty demands it. That is their true legacy, not the tactical successes or the enemy killed, but the simple fact that when asked to do something terrifying, they said yes and did it. That courage, that willingness to face the darkness, is timeless and deserves to be remembered.